So all of these traditions in traditional cultures, we really need to pay attention to. And the grain one is paramount because grains are a very important part of our diet, and there's no reason to leave them out. One of the things that happens when you do soak them is you make them more nutrient dense. You liberate the minerals. B vitamins go up many-fold. You start to create vitamin K. You start to create all sorts of things in there.
Welcome to the Wise Traditions Podcast, sponsored by the Weston A Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
I'm your host, Hoda Labrador. This is episode 58, and my guest is Fallon Morell, the head of the Weston A Foundation. Sally has spent decades researching and writing about the foods we should eat to best nourish our bodies. She is the author of the Nourishing Traditions Cookbook, and her research has had a profound influence on the real food and slow food movements around the world. Today's topic is super relevant because many trendy diets restrict the intake of grains, but Sally talks about how they can be of benefit to us, as long as they are properly prepared for ease of digestion and to unlock their valuable nutrient content. Before we begin, I want to take a moment and recognize our sponsors. Wise Traditions is supported in part by the Nutritional Therapy Association, real education for people who believe in real food. Go to nutritionaltherapy.com, and Just Thrive Probiotic and Antioxidant, the probiotic everyone's talking about. Go to thriveprobiotic.com. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Sally.
Thank you, Hilda. It's great to be back again.
So today we're talking about principle number 6, is that right?
That's right. That's the $64,000 question, really. Should we eat grains? You know, there's so much controversy on this today, and also so many people are having trouble with grains, especially wheat, that it's just like the big question in nutrition today.
Yeah, it almost seems like a fad to eat gluten-free or to feel like someone's gluten intolerant, but it's more than that. It's a reality, isn't it?
It's a definite reality, and I think partially it's a reality because remember we had 20, 30 years of people being told to eat whole grains, and people were dutifully doing that, but they weren't doing it in the right way, and so that's caused all these problems.
What do you mean they weren't doing it in the right way?
Well, so here's the question. Should we eat grains, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if we look at traditional cultures, many cultures ate grains. Not all of them, but many cultures ate grains. And by grains, we also mean seeds, nuts, legumes, grains, all those seeds, right?
Right.
But when they ate them, they prepared them very carefully. And when you think about it, grains are very hard to digest. They have a kind of plastic coating around them that is a system of preservatives for all the good things in the grains, but those preservatives are deliberately hard to digest so that they stay there, so that the grain lasts for a long time. Now, what allows or causes a grain to sprout? Well, it's in the ground, it's got its moisture. When it gets warm, you need a slight acidity in the ground, and then you also need some time. And that's what traditional cultures did. They moistened these grains in some way. They soaked them or they made the sourdough. It was a slightly acidic medium, and it was warm and in time. And that's nature's system for neutralizing all of these preservatives, these anti-nutrients. And once that happens, the grain can sprout. Basically, all the nutrition in the grain is liberated and ready to use. And as far as humans are concerned, that process makes the grains easy to digest. And before, they're hard to digest. You know, cellulose is impossible to digest. So this process makes the grains digestible for humans.
Oh my gosh, I just had a huge light bulb go off in my head. No one ever explained it to me that way before. Basically, what you're saying is that protective coating is not something that makes it easy for us to digest. It makes the grain able to last a long time.
Exactly.
So it's like nature set it up so we could have the grain stored, for example.
Exactly.
But it wasn't meant for us to eat it that way.
Exactly. And now animals that eat grains and grasses and things have very complex digestive systems with anywhere from 2 to 4 stomachs. they can't digest these seeds either. The only way to get at the goodness in the seeds is to ferment them, and that's what those stomachs do. At least one of those stomachs acts as a holding tank full of bacteria, and it breaks the grains down. It provides acidity and moisture and warmth, and over time they break down. Well, we only have one stomach. We are carnivores. We're a lot more like dogs or wolves. We just have one stomach, and we don't really have a fermentation tank inside of us. So we need to use that fermentation tank before we eat the grains. So we put them in a pot, and we make it acidic and warm, and leave it there for a while, and then they are much more digestible.
And this is what traditional cultures have been doing to eat these seeds and grains. They've been doing this as part of their traditional wisdom, right?
Exactly. And I don't really know of any exceptions. I'm happy to be shown one, but when I've learned about this, I started looking at all these different cultures, and they all ferment the grains in one way or another. And I thought I'd give you a little background. So, I've always been interested in nutrition. And back in the 70s, of course, when I got started and I started having my children, whole grains, that was the thing, whole grains. All the cookbooks were about whole grains. And one of the big popular things was granola. So I thought, I'm going to start making granola. And I honestly feel that I made the best granola on the planet. I had all these different grains and nuts, and I had maple syrup and lots of butter and everything. Well, I got really sick. I got this terrible digestive problem. I'm sure it was candida. I would have to lie down every day. I got kind of anemic. I would get, I'd go through like a toxic shock where I'd get really sweaty and cold. And I didn't put the two and two together, but it was just at the time when I was starting to work on the book. And someone told me he said, we really need to make a sourdough bread because that ferments the grains and makes them easier to digest. And he told me a little bit about how they did oatmeal in Germany. They soaked it in water with a little lemon juice or vinegar, and the light bulb went on, just like it just went on. With you. That's why I'm feeling so terrible. I'm eating all these grains and I can't digest them. So as soon as I got off the granola, within about 2 weeks, I was fine. Back to my old self.
Wow.
So I really learned the lesson myself. And then I realized there was another thing in my life. I thought I was allergic to oatmeal because as a child, my mother would make oatmeal. And when at about 10 o'clock in the morning, I'd get extremely sick, like a toxic shock reaction. And I said I just wouldn't eat it anymore because I thought I must be allergic. So then I thought, well, let's soak this oatmeal and see what happens. And I had absolutely no reaction. So something about the soaking, it's not only liberating the nutrients, making it more digestible, but it's getting rid of toxins because there are toxins in those seeds too.
Well, this is a really important conversation because I feel like granola is still popular,
It
granola
is.
bars, nuts. Everyone thinks, oh, I'm so healthy, I'm eating a handful of cashews. But if they're not properly prepared.
Muesli. You see muesli, and people are eating that raw. They're just putting it in milk or water and eating it raw. They're not even cooking it.
So talk to me, do we need to start soaking everything? Like, how do we get started in properly preparing these things?
Well, I would start with oatmeal. And of course, all this is in my book, Nourishing Traditions. You soak the oats overnight in warm water, and you just put a squeeze of lemon juice in there, or a little bit of whey or yogurt. You want a slight acidity, and warm water, and overnight. So there's your moisture, warmth, slight acidity, and time. And then the next morning, you cook up your oatmeal with some salt, and you eat the oatmeal with a natural sweetener and some butter or cream. You want that butter or cream because you need the fat-soluble vitamins to absorb the minerals. So, and that would be the first thing I would do. I would become an oatmeal soaker. And the second thing I would do is buy genuine sourdough bread and see if that agrees with you better. So those are the two main things. The other wonderful recipe from Nourishing Tradition is the pancakes, where you grind your own whole grain flour and you soak it in yogurt overnight.
Well, this sounds delicious, and I'm sure this is great news for people who've been thinking, oh, I need to go low carb, I need to avoid all grains.
And, for an adult, you can do what you want, but I think for a child, to tell them there's this huge group of food that you can't have. I think that's very bad psychology, and so much better to say, oh, we can have these things. We just have to be a little bit careful with how we prepare them. And I remember getting a letter from a woman who said, I get tears in my eyes every time I make the pancakes from your book, because finally, here's this really great, typical food, grain food, and my kids can eat it.
Oh, that's
So I
fantastic.
think it's a much better psychology for your children to be able to say, oh yes, we can eat all these things, but we're just going to be a little bit careful so they don't give you a tummy ache.
Now, is this something that Dr. Price noticed as well?
Actually not. He did describe people eating grains, for example, the quinoa in South America, wheat in North Africa, oats in the Outer Hebrides, rye in Switzerland. So he did describe people eating grains, but he didn't get the soaking or the fermenting part. He didn't ask the questions. He didn't even know to look for that.
Right.
I'm sure he would have found it if he'd asked. And when you think of it, the Swiss bread, that was a sourdough bread. So they were definitely preparing it properly.
And the same goes for nuts as well. In other words, they need to be prepared a certain way because there are anti-nutrients that are difficult for us to digest.
Yes, there's a lot of enzyme inhibitors in the nuts. I don't know if you've ever had the reaction to nuts where you eat some nuts and the inside of your mouth gets kind of fuzzy.
I've heard of that.
Or you get a stomach ache from them. Now, roasting is a way of getting rid of some of these anti-nutrients. But a better way is what we call crispy nuts, where we soak the nuts in salt water 6 to 8 hours, and then we dehydrate them.
So if I buy organic, I'm very interested in this because I love to eat nuts. If I go buy organic nuts somewhere, they probably have not been soaked.
Unless they say so on the label. I mean, like we actually in our store, we sell crispy nuts.
Oh, you do?
Somebody's making them.
Uh-huh.
And I would use the Weston A. Price Foundation shopping guide. I'm sure there'll be some soaked nuts in there.
But if I wanted to go old school and do it myself, do you have a recipe in Nourishing Traditions?
Yes. So I have pecans, cashews, walnuts, almonds. Yeah. So I have them all as crispy nuts.
And does it need to go through the same 4 steps you were saying earlier?
Well, we do the nuts a little differently because we don't do them in an acidic medium. We do them in a salty medium. And again, I don't really have the science for this.
Uh-huh.
But I do know that, for example, the Aztecs soak their nuts in salt water. And the pistachios in the Middle East are soaked in salt water. So I thought it must be a little different for nuts. And I'd love for someone to look into this further. But I can tell you that a lot of people have said, oh, I can digest these nuts. I don't have a problem with them like I do with normal nuts.
And they taste so good. I had
Yeah.
some at the conference.
Yes.
They were fantastic.
Yes, they taste like the pecans. They get a real buttery taste. They taste sweeter.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, they do taste differently. And if you're going to make nuts into a food, and rather than just a little topping or something, you definitely need to do this.
So you were talking about the Swiss and their rye bread. Can you give more examples of how this plays out in different cultures?
Well, yes, I found an old recipe for oats in Ireland that was made by not only soaking the oats and cooking them, but then they put them aside and let them ferment for a couple of weeks. So that was a very good example. The Cherokee bread among the Native Americans, they cook the corn and then they wrap the corn in a corn husk and put it aside for 2 weeks.
Like the tamales.
The tamale was originally a fermented food. And the tortilla was also, because then they took the fermented dough and made a little ball of it, flattened it on a hot rock, and that was the tortilla. We just are publishing an article about Iran in our journal, and the original flatbread from Iran was fermented. It was a sourdough flatbread. Now they got away from that. They stopped doing that because there have been studies of people eating a lot of this flatbread that they didn't ferment, and they got zinc deficiency because the phytic acid blocked the zinc in the bread. It was there. Zinc is there, but because it hadn't been prepared right, they were not absorbing the zinc.
It's like we've taken this shortcut, because I feel like a lot of breads around the world probably started out having gone through this fermentation process or this properly prepared process.
Yeah.
And now we're not doing that anymore.
Exactly. In fact, when yeast came in, before yeast, everything had to be sourdough. So they made their bacterial culture and they made a sourdough. When yeast came, and it first came to France, a lot of doctors spoke out and said, this new bread is not healthy. We need to have the old bread, the pain au levain, not the pain au levure. And they said the new yeast breads are not good for you. But you could do the yeast so much more quickly. You could do the yeasted bread in a couple hours rather than 24 hours. And now they've got a method, it's called the Chorleywood method, where from seed to package is 1 hour. It's so fast, so there's nothing can happen to mitigate the problems with the grains. The one other culture I wanted to tell you about were the Australian Aborigines. They were considered extremely primitive. They actually were very, very wise people. But they put their grains in what they call leaching baskets and soak them in, let them run in a stream for 2 weeks. Again, that same period of time, 2 weeks. And only after they did that would they eat them. And a lot of the beans that they ate were toxic, but if they soak them, then they could eat them.
Oh my gosh, that's fascinating. And again, the question comes, where did they get this wisdom?
Yes.
Right? Where did this come from? We don't have the answer to that, but we can look back to them for ideas on how to eat our food today.
Yes, I think, the question of where they got the wisdom is a very interesting question. It gets us into a lot of esoteric discussions.
Yes.
But how they got it is kind of immaterial because we see that they did do these things and we ignore all this at our peril. They have a lot of wisdom to give us, and that was the genius of Dr. Price. He said, these primitive people, you think they don't know anything and they have nothing to give us, but actually what they know is more important for us than what we know for them. And what they know and their dietary habits, we have to learn them. Otherwise, we will not survive as a civilization. So it wasn't just eating the organ meats and the fats, but it was also how they prepare their grains, how they do their agriculture, even what time of year they eat certain things. They only ate fruits at a certain time of year because that's when they were the best. So all of these traditions in traditional cultures, we really need to pay attention to. And the grain one is paramount because grains are a very important part of our diet, and there's no reason to leave them out. One of the things that happens when you do soak them is you make them more nutrient dense. You liberate the minerals, the B vitamins go up many-fold. You start to create vitamin K, you start to create all sorts of things in there.
This reminds me of something you said in another episode, that when we cook certain foods, we do the same thing.
Yes.
In other words, we can eat kale raw, which a lot of people do, but we're not getting the benefit of it, the full benefit of it.
And you might even be getting toxins from it.
Mm-hmm.
It might be toxic for you. But whereas when you cook things, especially plant foods, you neutralize the toxins, you liberate the minerals, you break down the cellulose, and then they become food for humans.
Mm-hmm.
We want to pause just now and thank our sponsors that help keep the podcast going. The Nutritional Therapy Association. They train and certify nutritional therapy practitioners, emphasizing whole, properly prepared, nutrient-dense food as a key to restoring balance and restoring the body's ability to heal. Based on the teachings of Weston A. Price. Learn more at nutritionaltherapy.com. And Just Thrive Probiotic and Antioxidant. Research-based probiotic with human clinical trials on leaky gut. The first 100% spore-forming probiotic that arrives alive in the intestines naturally. Supports optimal gut health, digestive health, immune health, and delivers antioxidants. Great for adults, kids, the whole family. The probiotic everyone's talking about. Just Thrive Probiotic and Antioxidant. Visit their website at thriveprobiotic.com.
Sally, so some people say, even if the grains are soaked, we really are better off staying away from them.
Right, and they're too high in carbs, or they don't give us anything. And I do agree that we don't want to have too much grain in our diet. You want a nice balance with your animal foods. I'm reading a fascinating book right now by a man named Cabeza de Vaca. He was a early explorer, and he was the first person to live with the Texas Indians. And there were just 3 of them and himself, so 4 people, and they traveled along the Gulf of Mexico and then into Texas and Mexico. And the tribes along the Gulf of Mexico, they were always hungry. They were sick. They didn't have much to eat. They didn't grow corn. They ate fish and some nuts and some tubers, but they didn't have corn, and they didn't have the buffalo. And when he got inland and the Indians had better soil and they could grow the corn and they had the buffalo, he said they were magnificent people, and there was no disease among them. They were 7 feet tall and very hardy and well formed, and they weren't hungry. And he said they were nicer too. They understood things better. They were nicer and more curious. And so I think, we need both these things. We need the grains in our diet, and we need the animal foods in our diet. And then you really do have a diet that sustains good reproduction, good growth, good health all your life.
Oh, very interesting. So we were laughing earlier because cabeza de vaca means cow head.
Yes.
So an unusual name, but it sounds like he observed what dietary changes could be helpful.
He really was a remarkable man. And not only that, he made friends with the Indians and really was trying to help them. And at the same time, the other Spaniards were taking them into slavery. And he was shocked by this, and he said that he was going to try to stop it. He wasn't able to stop it, but yeah. So we had these 2 forces from the very early days: those who wanted to exploit these traditional cultures, and people like Cabeza de Vaca, who was just interested and wanted to help and admired them, and very much admired them for the way they lived.
Wow. Sally, I feel like more and more people are diagnosing themselves with gluten sensitivities, or their doctors are telling them you're allergic to gluten. What about those people?
Okay, so gluten, actually, it's a little layer of complexity on all this, because gluten is a protein in certain grains, mainly wheat, that is extremely hard to digest. Now, there is an enzyme in our guts that breaks down gluten, but obviously people are lacking this, or they have some kind of gut problem, and some people really do have to get off of gluten. I have my daughter cannot eat gluten. But I think it's more than the gluten. I think it's the way we've raised the wheat, the way we've bred the wheat. Wheat has 10 applications of chemicals from seed to storage. And then, of course, we're preparing it wrong, all these things. So someone who's really has a hard time with wheat, I say, you have to get off of it. You have to repair the gut, get a lot of good flora in the gut, and then try the sourdough with lots of butter on it. And most people who couldn't tolerate gluten do fine in those circumstances. And there was actually a couple studies in Italy where they took people diagnosed as celiac and gave them genuine sourdough bread, and they had no problem digesting the genuine sourdough bread because it's been pre-digested.
Oh, I love that.
So that seems to take care of the gluten. It won't work for everyone. And we're actually getting a lot of children today who are extremely sensitive to these grains. Again, I think it's because their guts are not formed properly. They didn't get enough of the right nutrition in the womb. And also, I think that we're introducing the grains too early also. We really should wait till they're a year. And then they should be soaked or sourdough, properly prepared.
Wow, and I feel like a lot of doctors now recommend that we introduce rice cereal at 6 months or something.
Oh yeah, it's interesting. The American Academy of Pediatrics, who should know the most about this, right? That was their suggestion. The first food should be rice cereal, iron-fortified rice cereal. Well, it's a little embarrassing for them because now they found that this rice cereal is so high in arsenic. Oh. So the babies were getting lots of arsenic, plus, grains they couldn't digest. And now if you kind of hunt around on their website, you'll find studies saying, well, maybe we should be giving these babies meat for iron, not the rice cereal. So, that's the wrong food to start a baby off on. Mm-hmm. Babies need pureed liver, pureed meats, egg yolks, very nutrient-dense foods to begin with.
Neat. And I'm going to have another episode with Sandrine Perez soon about what first foods to feed the babies. So
okay.
I'm excited about that.
Well, I'm doing a series of blogs now at my blog, nourishingtraditions.com, about feeding babies and making sure that moms introduce the grains later and not earlier.
Fantastic.
And I think we've actually had a kind of overreaction because we were giving babies the wrong things, and it caused a lot of digestive problems. And now moms are saying, well, we won't give babies anything. We'll just nurse them and no more until they're a year or more, exclusive breastfeeding. And that's not right either. In traditional cultures, the average age for introducing solid food is 5 months.
Really?
Yes. So 4 to 6 months. Some cultures introduce foods, not grains, but foods at 1 month.
Wow.
So we say 4 to 6 months, and the first foods should not be grains. They should be animal foods.
Well, we'll stay tuned to your blog
Yes,
and to these other episodes. As we begin to wrap up, if people could only do one thing to improve their health related to the grains, as we've been discussing, what would you recommend?
I would recommend that you buy genuine sourdough bread. Use our shopping guide because it's hard to find the real sourdough bread, not bread that's sour. Sometimes they just add vinegar, but genuine sourdough bread, and eat it with plenty of butter. So, because the fats help with the digestion also, and that has been shown in studies. So that's a really good way to improve your health and actually include two delicious foods in your diet.
Yes, it sounds delicious. My mouth is watering. Well, thank you for your time today, Sally.
Oh, you're welcome. It's a pleasure.
My guest today was Sally Fallon Morell, the president of the Weston A. Price Foundation. For resources related to today's show, including highlights from our discussion, links to Sally's blog, and the name of the book about the Spanish explorer, visit the Foundation's website at westonaprice.org. Click on the word podcast and look for the show notes for episode 58.
Did you know that there are Weston A. Price Foundation chapters all over the U.S. and around the world? Chapter leaders help you find good food in your area, and some have meetings you can attend. Go to our website, westonaprice.org, and click on Find a Local Chapter to see if there is one near you. Wise Traditions is brought to you by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. The content of this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for medical advice.